The Wonky Trim Square and the Wonky Trim Triangle are two rulers that were made to work together. On this quilt, you'll notice that the center squares were cut 6.5 inches, so they finished 6 inches. And the wonky part comes in when you add triangles to all sides, which tilts the block 22.5 inches. Now the block can be tilted to the left or the right, and when you combine those, it creates all kinds of secondary patterns. In this case, we created a large diamond shape that is opposite colors. So it makes beautiful secondary patterns that are fun. In this case, it's a children's quilt, and so the tilt to the pattern adds additional interest and just makes it fun. Now I'll show you how to create these units. In this example, the center blocks were fussy cut 6.5 inches. Fussy cutting just means that I cut out the portion of the print on the fabric that I want to show. So in this case, I cut a 6.5 inch square and it shows surfboards. I then cut a piece of fabric 6.5 inches, and I'm going to remove the salvage on one side. And all I need is a straight edge, so I'm just going to go ahead and use the Wonky Trim Square and throw the salvages away. Now I can take the Wonky Tilt Triangle and I can place it on that straight edge, and since I cut it 6.5 inches, the blunt tip is going to be up here to allow for my seam allowance, and then I have a straight edge right there. So I will just cut the angle, rotate it, and cut the angle again, and I can continue all the way up the square. And if you'll notice here, I cut the strips with the fabric wrong side together. Now normally if I am doing one block, I am cutting the fabric so all of them are cut with the fabric right side up, or all of them are cut with the fabric wrong side up. So I'll show you the difference. If I am doing one with the fabric right side up, and I sew them around my center block, that block is going to tilt to the left. If I cut them with the fabric wrong side up, I am going to have a reverse of that, and my block will tilt to the right. The only thing I have to do differently is either put the fabric on my cutting mat right side up or wrong side up to create the different tilts. So it is very simple to do. The ruler has a hole drilled right here, which is the center of this long angle. So I take a pen, and any kind of water-soluble tool will do, and you can lay it on these pieces and mark through the hole so I know exactly where I need to line up that piece. I also took it and placed it on the square, so I just lined this up. There's also a hole on the straight edge. I placed it there and marked through that hole, so my fussy cut 6.5 inch square has the mark on it, and my triangles all have the mark. So all I have to do is line up those marks and sew that seam, and I'll be good to go. Now what we have you do is on the first seam, we have you start in the middle and sew out this way, and then add the triangles all the way around, and this will be open because when you sew this one on, I can flip this back so this fabric will be on top, and it gives me a little bit more of a seam allowance right there. So when I complete my blocks, these triangles are going to be a little bit oversized, and you'll have blocks like this. One tilts to the left and one tilts to the right. Because we did that partial seam, the large piece was always on top, so it gave us a little bit more of a fudge factor so that we could square these up. Now once these are sewn together, you can take a straight edge or any square and square up two sides to get your 1/4 inch seam allowance, or you can use the Wonky Trim Square. The Wonky Trim Square has black markings for blocks that tilt in this direction. I can place it right on top and line up the block right in there and trim, which automatically means that I have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance away from each one of these points. If my block is tilting in the opposite direction, there are white lines on the ruler, and I simply match up that square with the white lines, and my block will be tilted in the opposite direction, and it automatically gives me my 1/4 of an inch seams away from every point. Now, the reason it is nice to have those fit perfectly is because if I want to join these like I did in the quilt I showed you, my points will match exactly here, and that's how I create that secondary diamond pattern that I showed you in the quilt earlier. Now, there are a lot of fun things that you can do with this ruler. Instead of just sewing plain squares or cutting plain strips, I can sew 2 strips together and cut my pieces from that. So if I do that and then cut my triangles out of it, there is a line on the triangle that I would place this on the seam allowance, and so I would get that shape exactly where I needed it to be, and this seam would be in the exact same place every time. Then I can put the fussy cut ruler over it, line up the black square, and this time, if you'll notice, there are black lines here. I would place those on the seam lines, and then when I trim it, I'm going to have my perfect 1/4 of an inch seam allowance all the way around. On this one, if you notice when I was cutting those, since I'm cutting them out of squares, I'm going to get a square with the blue on the outside and a square with the green on the outside, because this is going to be the mirror image of this, and if I cut it with the fabric right side up or wrong side up, I'm going to get a set of each of these out of each strip set. So you have to allow for that in your directions. So both of these tilt to the left, but they have opposite colors up here. These two tilt in the opposite direction, but it was done with the same set of strips, but this time, because again it's a mirror image, this portion is just going to be the little blue when I switch the ruler 180 degrees like we did before, and you get an opposite set. Again, I'm going to take this time the white marks on the ruler, and there are white straight lines to show where this seam allowance is. I'll place it on top of there, trim a 1/4 of an inch away around, and when I piece these together, then I'm going to be able to match all my seams. This ruler is really fun to play with because you have a lot of options. In this case, I just placed 2 rectangles right sides together at a 45-degree angle and sewed across that seam, removed it, and so I end up with this pieced unit. This time, there is a diagonal line on the ruler. When I place it on here and cut out my pieces, I can get 2 out of every one of these piece sets. So I'll have one with the large part of the triangle being blue and one with the large part being green. So when I piece those around the block, I'm going to get a secondary pattern that forms because the angle comes down through the middle of the block. So here are the 2 that I pieced, and see the blue again, you're going to have opposite fabrics. And here again, you're going to have the opposite colors here in each set of triangles that you do. I'm going to get one of each. So I'm going to get one with a large blue bottom and one with a large green bottom. It just depends on if I cut them with the fabric right side up or the fabric right side down. And again on the ruler, these are tilting in this direction, so I'm going to follow the white line, and there's a dashed diagonal line that will go on this cross seam. So you can always use this to square up all of your blocks. But the triangle can be used individually because I can take that triangle, and once these are all pieced, they are oversized, so I can trim a 1/4 of an inch away from 2 adjoining sides and I will be fine. Now in this case, the Wonky Square works with 6-inch finished inside blocks, but the Wonky Triangle was designed to use any size you want. So you can take these markings on the ruler. If I was doing a 5-inch square, I would cut my strips 5 inches, and I could use the Wonky Square to cut anything from 1 inch to 6 inches and finish blocks. This adds my seam allowance, and I would be fine. I can use this for any size block I like. In this example, I took a butterfly And I fussy cut that, but it was only about a 3-inch square. So I fussy cut that and just sashed it out, and then used the Wonky Triangle to wonk the entire block, and got something that looks like this. Very cute, and this inner border adds a lot of color to the block. In this example, I took a pinwheel that was a 6-inch finished pinwheel and did the Wonky Triangle to add it to all sides and to wonk a piece block. It does not have to be a fussy cut square. You can use piece blocks and trim them up to a 6-inch size, and then add this to make sure that everything is the exact size.
Penny has already shown you how to use these rulers, the Wonky Triangle and the Wonky Trim Square. And what I'd like to show you today is some different techniques on how you can use these rulers and apply them to different types of fabrics. So what we'll start is with the more simple, just using a plain fabric and a pattern fabric together. And as you can see, with this particular quilt here, we have a square, 6.5-inch square cut in pattern fabric, and we've used the Wonky Triangle to cut the 2 red pieces and the 2 black pieces, which make 1 square. And the next one is just a black square cut 6.5 inches, 2 red triangles, 2 black triangles, and then stitched together to give the wave effect. So if I hold this up, you'll see how it gives dimension. Now if we change the fabric to a lighter fabric, we get a much different effect. Now there will be a pattern available for this particular quilt, and so just keep an eye out for that one. Instead of doing just plain squares of fabric, you can actually place some machine embroidery into the squares before you tilt them using the Wonky Triangle, and then to trim your squares back, the Wonky Trim Square. Now this particular quilt here, you can see all of the squares are facing the same way, so they're not tilted backwards and forwards. And you know, with the Wonky Tilt Triangle, if you cut your fabric with the right side facing up, your square will tilt to the left. If you cut your fabric with the right side facing down, your square will tilt to the right. In this particular instance, you can see all of the squares are tilting to the left. And it's just a fussy cut square of batik fabric with the plane either side of the square and tilted, and then trimmed using the Wonky Trim Square. So that's just another way you can arrange the squares once they're tilted, and you get a whole different effect again. Now with this particular quilt, we call this licorice all sort, and what we've done is made the 6.5-inch squares, as you can see here, using the straight out of line ruler before we've actually tilted the square using the Wonky Tilt Triangle and the Wonky Trim Square. So that's just another option that you can do with your 6.5-inch square before you tilt it. And as you can see, these are tilted both left and right to give a different effect. This particular quilt is done with using applique, and we've left one square straight and then tilted the other 2 either side, and then on the next line tilted the centre, and the either side are straight. And these are appliqued, so the heart is appliqued using a blanket stitch, and the flower is appliqued using a blanket stitch, still using the Wonky Triangle and the Wonky Trim Square to get perfect squares before you join. But if you don't want to do applique, what you can do is just fussy cut a piece of fabric, and this next quilt that I'm going to show you is exactly the same as this one, except there's no applique involved. So if you don't want to do the applique, all you have to do is fussy cut the fabric, and this is the result that you will get. And there's so many beautiful fabrics available at the moment that just pop colour, and the families of fabric go very well together with this particular project. As you can see, we have fussy cut our 6.5 inch squares here, used the Wonky Triangle to tilt that square, and again fussy cut the smaller size square and bordered it the same way that we have bordered with the Wonky Triangle. With this quilt, we call this the Australian Flora quilt, and as you can see, what we've done using the Wonky Triangle and the Wonky Trim Square, we have fussy cut pieces of fabric, and one is bordered and then tilted, and this one we have tilted and then bordered, so we get this effect. Now, as you can see, this is done in dark brown, green colours with Australian flora in the squares, but if we change the fabric, we get an entire different effect, and I'll just show you one that's been done with a different fabric, exactly the same way, using exactly the same two rulers, the Wonky Triangle and the Wonky Trim Square, and you can see the different effect that you get with the brighter colours. Also, fussy cut that square in the centre so that you get exactly the same flower in the centre of each square. So you can see just by changing your fabric around, you will get a whole different effect, and using exactly the same pattern. There is a pattern available for this one. This particular quilt, what we've done, we've actually used our applique and the Wonky Triangle and the Wonky Trim Square to get a ribbon-like effect, and also satin stitch on the pentagon in the middle, and a little bit of machine embroidery for the flag and the star and the Statue of Liberty. With the pentagon, we've actually created a maze. But by using the Wonky Triangle and the Wonky Trim Square, what we actually get is a ribbon-like effect weaving through the flags, just by tilting one square one way and the other square the other way. On this table runner, we've used just the plain fabric again, the solid fabric, either side of our 6.5 inch block, and you can see the weaving pattern that we get using the Wonky Triangle and the Wonky Trim Square. So it gives you that lovely effect. But if we do a vertical join on our piece of fabric before we cut it with the Wonky Triangle, we get a whole different effect again. I have another example to show you. As you can see, on either side here, we have a vertically joined piece and then a solid piece. And the same on this one. Now you can see that the value, it's a small piece of yellow and a large piece of white either side. So it's the same value of fabric on each side. Now on the Wonky Trim Square, there is, in fact, this is what our square would look like once we've put our corners and triangles on, once they've been cut with the Wonky Triangle. We place the Wonky Trim Square onto that square, and once we have a vertical join, we can see that the vertical lines coming out from the square that should go around our tilted central square are exactly on those seam lines. That then allows us to rotary cut straight around that square and give us our exact 1/4 inch seam allowance from each point. Now what this does is when we join it together, we get perfect joined points. All of our points are perfectly joined. So that's why these extra lines are on this Wonky Trim Square. If our square was tilting in the opposite direction, so it was tilting to the right, what we would find is we would use the white lines, and that would run down the vertical join. So I'll just show you some examples of quilts that have been done with a vertical join, and we refer to these as technique patterns. This one here is a vertical join technique pattern, and it's just fussy cut fabric. Any fabric that you have in your stash you can use, and you can see that this one is done with 2 different values of triangle in the vertical. So you've got a small piece of green, a large piece of red in the one triangle, and if you have a look at the triangle on the opposite, on the other side, it's a large piece of green and a large piece of red. Now, by trimming that using the Wonky Trim Square, you'll find that all of the seams will perfectly match up. So you get these lovely designs in the diamond in between the squares of fabric. So that's tilting one way and then the other way. Again, cutting our fabric right side up or right side down. If we wanted, what we could do is use any nursery print or children's print that you like, and see these ones, what we've done with these, they're all facing in the same direction. Again, we have 2 values, large piece of red, small piece of green on opposite sides, and then on these 2 sides, large red, small red and large green on these 2 sides here. On the next line, after we've put a piece of sashing through the centre, these squares are facing all the other way. So we get this design going on in the centre. So you can see just by rearranging those squares, either tilting left or right, joining up those seams with sashing in the middle, we get a whole different effect again. So this opens up another world with the Wonky Triangle and the Wonky Trim Square. Now with this particular instance, what we've done is joined our piece before we've cut our triangles using the Wonky Triangle. We've joined it on a 45-degree angle. So in the instructions, you can see how to do your join with a 45-degree angle, and also your other joins that have been previously explained. So this is how you join your fabric to do your 45-degree angle before it's cut. Now once it's cut using the Wonky Triangle, you'll notice that on the Wonky Triangle there is a dotted line down here. Now that should go on the seam of the joined piece, on the 45-degree joined piece before you cut your triangle. Once you've cut your triangle and put it onto either side of the 6.5-inch square block, when you place the Wonky Trim Square on, you'll notice that the square is around the square in the centre, and the seam line, the diagonal seam line, is exactly on the diagonal seam line. So that's why this Wonky Trim Square is so important to have with the Wonky Tilt Triangle. You can see with this particular one, we have done a 45-degree joined piece on each side of the square, and then a solid piece of different colours either side, and that will give you this sort of effect. We've used 2 different values, so we've used both pieces that we've cut from our rectangle. We have a dark red and the light tip, and the red tip and the light bottom. So you can see how they will then all join up to give this lovely pattern. If we use a 45-degree joined triangle on each side, we get a different effect again. So I'm going to hold those up together so that you can actually see the different types of effects that you get just by joining your pieces of fabric before cutting them with the Wonky Triangle. If we take that one step further and make a little quilt, tilting each way, we end up with this lovely pattern in the centre, and see how all of our seams perfectly match up because we've used those lines on the Wonky Trim Square. It just makes it so much easier to have that exact 1/4 inch seam allowance and be able to trim around that square. Now in this particular case, what we've done is taken small squares from a panel, and any panel that you have you can use, and I'll show you some panels that are available that can be used, and I'll show you another quilt that can be made. This is a small square and then just the solid pieces put either side to form a small wonky square and facing one way and then the other. On this particular quilt we have used a printed panel, tilted it one way using the Wonky Triangle and the Wonky Trim Square, and then tilted it back the other way so that it straightens it up. And once we do that, we get these beautiful stars forming in the centre. Now this particular panel can be replaced by any one that you see, and these are just some here that are available. So what you could do with this one is just fussy cut each one of these squares using your Wonky Triangle and your Wonky Trim Square, and do exactly what we've done with the doll fabric. Some other fabrics that could be used in exactly the same way is this beautiful nursery print. You can see these lovely blocks that are in this panel. So excuse me, you would fussy cut the blocks and then tilt them forwards and backwards, and there's other companion pieces to go with this entire story of fabric. So you'd use those companion pieces so that everything matched up beautifully. There's a pink in this nursery which is on this side. So you can see you could do a pink or a blue in a boy's quilt. This particular one is one of my favourites. This is a lovely panel of flowers with beautiful verses on it. So we would just fussy cut them around to 6.5 inches using these lovely companion fabrics to do the triangles for the tilting, and that would make a lovely, lovely quilt. You could border it in black and it would just make all of these colours pop. It is this particular one, and just again fussy cut these 6.5 inch squares and tilt them left and right, and you would end up with a lovely table runner or a lovely quilt. Now most of the sewing that you've seen here today has been done by the other partner in the Sewing Revolution, who is Anne Duncan, and she's in Australia and couldn't be here with us today, but she has actually made most of these beautiful quilts that I've shown you today.